The streetlights in Carter's Ridge flickered the night she disappeared. It was a small town, the kind that still closed its diner at 9 and locked the gas station office after dark. The kind of place where everyone claimed they knew everyone else, until something like this happened, and suddenly no one knew anything at all. Her name was Rachel Whitmore, 27 years old. A nurse at the county hospital, recently divorced, trying to rebuild a life that never quite seemed to fit her. On March 3, 1998, she finished the late shift, clocked out at 11:42 p.m., and told a co-worker she was heading home to feed her dog. She never made it there. By morning, her car was found on the shoulder of Old Mill Road, engine off, driver's door open, keys still dangling in the ignition. The road cut through a patch of pine forest and followed the creek into town. The nearest house was nearly half a mile away. Deputies found her purse in the front seat, untouched. Her shoes were gone. At first, Sheriff Lowell Spencer thought it was a domestic situation. Rachel's ex-husband, Mark, was a local contractor with a temper people preferred not to talk about. But he had an alibi. He was out of town on a roofing job in Tennessee. A few co-workers confirmed it. With no sign of a struggle, no footprints, and no witnesses, it became one of those cases that lived in the quiet corners of small-town rumor. The next few days blurred together. Volunteers searched the woods. Local news filmed the sheriff giving the same speech every night. "We're following all leads." But there weren't any leads, and Carter's Ridge began to change in a way that only fear can change a place. Porch lights stayed on all night. The sidewalks emptied earlier. Parents stopped letting their kids walk home from school. What no one knew then was that Rachel's disappearance was only the beginning, and that it would eventually expose something much darker hidden beneath that town's calm surface. 2 weeks after she vanished, a fisherman downriver found a white sneaker tangled in driftwood. Inside was a piece of paper folded into quarters, almost fused from the water. It wasn't a note, but a page from a hospital chart, Rachel's handwriting across the top. At first, investigators thought it was just litter from her job, but when the state lab examined it, the ink was different. It wasn't the blue pen she used at work. It was black, written after she left. The words were short and strange. "It wasn't supposed to be me." The discovery reignited the search, but the sheriff was losing control of the narrative. The local paper ran a front-page headline, "Missing Nurse Leaves Message from the River," and suddenly, Carter's Ridge was on the map. Reporters came in from Jackson and Memphis, turning every porch into a potential interview set. The townspeople hated it, but they couldn't look away either. Behind the scenes, the investigation was faltering. Evidence went missing. Reports were filed late or not at all. The sheriff's department didn't have the resources or the experience for something that felt bigger than a local abduction. Then, 6 months later, the case went cold. Rachel Whitmore became another face on a bulletin board, another name read at candlelight vigils that fewer and fewer people attended. For years, that's where the story stayed. But in 2005, the case took a turn no one expected. A federal investigator named Agent Daniel Mercer was reviewing unsolved disappearances across rural Mississippi for a separate operation. His team had been tracking patterns of missing persons linked to medical institutions, employees, patients, records clerks. In most of the files, there was a shared signature, altered hospital logs, missing files, and strange notations that didn't match official handwriting. One of those names was Rachel Whitmore. Mercer requested her file from the Carter's Ridge Sheriff's Office. What he received was a half-inch thick folder, barely enough to cover a week's investigation. But tucked inside, mislabeled and misfiled, was a single Polaroid dated March 1st, 1998, 2 days before Rachel vanished. It showed the hospital parking lot. In the corner, partly out of frame, was a van with government plates. There was no record of any federal vehicle on site that night. Mercer called the hospital's former security chief, who'd since retired to Florida. The man's voice trembled when he heard the name. He remembered that van. "They said they were from a medical research division," he told Mercer. "But we didn't have any partnership with one." Something about the way he said it didn't sit right. Mercer requested the visitor log from that week. It was missing. Not lost. Physically removed from the archive shelf. When he asked who had last signed it out, the records clerk gave a name he didn't recognize. R. Simmons. The problem was, there had never been an R. Simmons employed by the hospital or the sheriff's office. The signature looked forced, almost traced, and then, without warning, the entire Carter's Ridge file system was placed under federal review. The town didn't know it yet, but the FBI had just reopened the case under a new designation, Project Meridian. The FBI set up a temporary field unit out of Jackson. Mercer and 2 analysts began reconstructing every piece of evidence that had gone missing. What they found was staggering. Several hospital employees from the same region had disappeared between 1996 and 1999. All women, all with access to patient records. And in every case, the last known evidence was a car found abandoned near a waterway. But there was something else. In Rachel's case, one file stood out. A list of patients from a closed psychiatric wing at St. Luke's Hospital, dated February 1998. Next to one name was a small asterisk and a handwritten note. Reassigned under federal order. The patient's name was blacked out. When Mercer submitted a clearance request to unseal it, the response came back stamped in red. Restricted. Departmentalize only. For investigators who'd spent years chasing dead ends, this kind of wall wasn't new. But the timing bothered him. Why would a psychiatric patient's record be federally restricted in a small Mississippi hospital? And why did a young nurse vanish 2 days after that transfer? Mercer drove to Carter's Ridge himself in August 2005. By then, the town had shrunk to half its old population. The old mill was boarded up, and the diner that once served the search teams was closed. Locals didn't like outsiders asking about Rachel Whitmore. They said the story had cursed the town. Businesses closed. Families moved away. Some swore strange men had come years ago asking the same questions, flashing badges that didn't look real. He met the former sheriff, Lowell Spencer, at his home off County Road 9. Spencer was retired, older, heavyset, still wearing his badge clipped to his belt like it gave him comfort. When Mercer asked about the night Rachel disappeared, the sheriff's eyes drifted away. "You're not the first to come looking," he said quietly, "but you might be the first with the right badge." Spencer admitted that the night Rachel vanished, a federal agent had come to his office unannounced. He said they were tracking an internal theft of medical property, confidential records, maybe evidence from an old experiment. They told him to stay out of it. He didn't argue. "They showed me a letter with a seal I'd never seen before," he said. "Told me if I valued my job, I'd call it a missing person and close the book." For the next few weeks, Mercer stayed in Carter's Ridge. He filed reports, collected interviews, and requested archived footage from a local TV station that had since gone bankrupt. Most of the tapes were degraded, but one broadcast from 1998 showed something chilling. During a nighttime search, as deputies walked along Old Mill Road, headlights passed behind them, a white van moving slowly down the embankment toward the river. It was the same model from the Polaroid. No one ever followed it. The broadcast ended there. But Mercer replayed the tape until he could make out a faint reflection on the van's side panel. The letters were incomplete, but enough remained to spell something faintly legible. DOE. It wasn't a company logo. It was a federal department, Department of Energy. At first glance, it made no sense. The DOE had no jurisdiction over missing persons. But when Mercer reached out to contacts in Washington, he learned that during the 1990s, the department had quietly overseen several classified biocontainment projects involving radiation exposure in medical facilities. Most of those records were sealed after public outcry. Rachel had worked the late shift in the same ward that once treated participants from one of those studies. The closer Mercer looked, the more he found that didn't add up. Disappearing files, sealed medical records, unexplained federal involvement. But the biggest revelation was still buried somewhere in the missing pages of the case file. And according to an old note scribbled on the margin of a form labeled Transfer Log, March 1998, there was one clue left. C Box 27B, Storage Facility, Meridian. When the FBI team finally tracked it down, they discovered that Box 27B had been signed out in 1999 by a man using the same alias, R. Simmons. That's when the investigation shifted from a missing person to something else entirely. Because inside the Bureau's system, R. Simmons wasn't just a name. It was an internal code, one used for restricted agents operating under contract for classified federal programs. The same code appeared again in an unrelated audit years later, on a list of personnel involved in off-site medical trials across the rural South. The FBI realized they weren't just chasing a cold case. They were about to uncover something buried deep within their own archives, something that had erased a woman, silenced a town, and vanished from public record for almost a decade. And it all started with a nurse who walked out after midnight. The storage facility in Meridian sat on the edge of an industrial park, between a shuttered feed mill and an empty tire warehouse. Most of the buildings there looked abandoned, but the locks were new. When the FBI team arrived on a gray morning in September 2005, they found the lot fenced, the gate chained, and a security camera mounted high above the entrance, its wiring running into the ground instead of the building. Agent Daniel Mercer signed the access order himself. Inside, dust coated everything except a narrow path that looked recently cleared. The air smelled faintly of ozone and bleach, as if someone had tried to erase whatever had been here before. They found Box 27B wedged against the back wall beneath an old tarp. The markings were faded, the label barely legible. Mercer sliced the tape and opened it carefully. Inside were 6 folders, a film reel, and a series of envelopes sealed in wax. Every envelope bore the same initials, RS. At first, it looked like standard hospital paperwork, admission forms, lab requests, dosage records. But the dates didn't match. Some were from 1996, some from 1999, long after Rachel Whitmore disappeared. And the patient ID numbers had been altered. Each record linked back to the same department at St. Luke's Hospital, the psychiatric wing Rachel once worked in. But the treatment codes were for radiation monitoring, not mental health. The team called in the Bureau's medical analyst, Dr. Carol Hensley. She spread the documents across the table, frowning as she read. "These aren't patient charts," she said quietly. "They're test logs. Someone was running exposure trials under psychiatric cover." That changed everything. The more Mercer examined the documents, the clearer it became that Rachel had stumbled into something she wasn't supposed to see. One memo, dated 2 days before she disappeared, referenced unauthorized personnel reviewing subject data. Another noted that containment protocols must be reinforced. The signature at the bottom matched the alias, R. Simmons. Still, there was no direct mention of Rachel, no proof she'd been silenced. Just a pattern that felt deliberate. Erased records, fake names, false leads. For weeks, Mercer's team reconstructed the timeline. Rachel's last recorded shift had her monitoring a patient named E. Cole, a 49-year-old former military technician, transferred from a federal facility in Alabama. Cole had no listed next of kin and no discharge paperwork. But his file included a cryptic note written in Rachel's hand. "Patient complains of ringing in ears. Requests outside contact." According to hospital logs, Cole died 3 days later. Cause of death: cardiac failure during observation. His body was cremated within 24 hours. Hensley compared his lab results to radiation exposure data from declassified DOE experiments in the 1970s. The numbers were almost identical. That night, Mercer sat alone in the motel outside Meridian, staring at the papers spread across his bed. He had seen cover-ups before, but this one had layers: medical, military, bureaucratic. It was as if a ghost protocol had been buried under a town that had stopped asking questions. He called his supervisor in D.C., Assistant Director Monroe. The call lasted less than 2 minutes. When Mercer mentioned the DOE connection, Monroe paused. "I need you to pause that line of inquiry," he said. "This might cross into classified jurisdiction." Mercer didn't argue, but the unease in his voice lingered long after the call ended. The next morning, when he returned to the storage facility, the lock on the gate had been replaced. The building's lease had been terminated overnight. Officially, the Bureau marked Box 27B as non-probative, but Mercer kept digital copies of everything before it was collected for storage. He couldn't let it go. He drove back to Carter's Ridge with a quiet conviction that whatever had swallowed that town had come from the outside, not within. The residents had been caught in the wake of something they didn't understand, and maybe didn't want to. The town itself looked worse than before. The Main Street storefronts were papered over, the old courthouse shuttered. Only the diner had reopened under new ownership. The waitress behind the counter, a woman in her 60s, recognized the FBI badge immediately. "You're here about the nurse," she said. "They all come back eventually." Mercer asked her what she meant. "People like you," she replied, setting down his coffee. "Always think they're gonna find something new. But whatever happened to her, it happened to all of us." She leaned in slightly. "You want to see what they left behind? You talk to Reverend Pike. He's the last one who still keeps the lights on at the church." The church sat on a hill overlooking the river. Once white, now gray with age, its steeple leaned slightly from years of storms. Reverend Pike was a thin man with kind eyes, more caretaker than preacher. He told Mercer he remembered Rachel well, said she came to him the week before she disappeared. "She looked scared," he said. "Said she found something at work she couldn't explain. Told me if anything happened, There was a box under her bed. Mercer's pulse quickened. Did anyone find it? The Reverend hesitated. They said the house was searched, but I never believed that. The next day, Mercer obtained a warrant to enter Rachel's old property. The house had long been abandoned, its windows boarded. Inside, dust hung in the air like ash. The floors creaked with every step. In the bedroom, he pulled back what was left of the bed frame and found a hollow gap between the floorboards. Inside was a small metal box, rusted but intact. Inside the box were two things: a cassette tape and a folded letter. The letter was addressed to whoever finds this. The handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. It read, "If you're reading this, I tried to tell them. They said it was a research grant, but the patients weren't sick. They were marked. I saw their names erased before they were transferred. One man said they were testing reactions to exposure. Said it wasn't the first time. I don't think they'll let me leave." At the bottom, her signature, Rachel Whitmore. The tape was labeled 228, Observation Wing. Mercer had it restored at the Jackson Field office. The recording was muffled, but clear enough. At first, there were just background sounds, the hum of machines, the shuffle of papers. Then a voice, female, nervous. Rachel's. "They told us to log the vitals manually," she said. "The computers are off. I don't know why they'd do that. Patient Cole keeps saying he's hearing a high-pitched tone no one else hears. He says it started after the injections. The lights flicker every time they draw his blood. I can't explain that. I think they're watching through the vents. If anyone ever hears this, please." The tape cut off there. When Mercer played it for his superiors, the response was swift and cold. The recording was entered into evidence and sealed under the Bureau's restricted file system. He was told not to speak of it, but what happened next told him everything he needed to know. A week later, the Reverend's church caught fire. Investigators called it an electrical fault, but locals whispered otherwise. Pike was found unconscious inside, barely alive. He swore he saw figures near the hill before the fire started. Men in dark jackets, unmarked cars, parked at the edge of the cemetery. And then, 2 days later, the diner closed again. The waitress who had spoken to Mercer packed up and left town. No forwarding address. By October, the Bureau reassigned Mercer to another case. Officially, Carter's Ridge was exhausted of leads. Unofficially, the deeper files of Project Meridian had been transferred to a restricted archive in Quantico. Mercer kept one thing, a copy of Rachel's letter. He kept it in a drawer at home, away from Bureau records. He couldn't stop thinking about the phrase she'd written, "They were marked." Months later, during an unrelated inquiry, he found a classified memorandum referencing a federal program from the early 1980s. It was called the Meridian Initiative, a joint effort between the Department of Energy and a private contractor to test the long-term effects of radiation exposure on human neural tissue. The project had supposedly ended in 1985, but someone had kept it alive, and now it had a trail of missing nurses, burned churches, and erased towns. Carter's Ridge wasn't just unlucky. It was collateral. By the end of 2005, Mercer understood what Rachel had uncovered, a ghost program running beneath the surface of small-town America, feeding off isolation and secrecy. The kind of project that left no witnesses. But if the Bureau had buried it once, someone inside had also left a breadcrumb trail, the kind that might lead to the missing files everyone was too afraid to mention. And those files, somewhere deep in the government's archives, held the truth of what really happened the night Rachel Whitmore walked out after midnight. The deeper Agent Daniel Mercer dug, the more it seemed Carter's Ridge wasn't an exception. It was a template. By early 2006, Mercer was working quietly, off the record, using bureau access that technically still existed under his credentials. He logged late nights in the Jackson field office, combing through archived case files tagged low priority or incomplete. He wasn't looking for names anymore. He was looking for patterns. They started to appear like ghosts across the map. Small rural towns in the South and Midwest, all with similar stories. A vanished hospital employee, a sudden loss of public records, a local disaster that followed soon after. In Louisiana, a nurse disappeared after a hospital fire in 1997. In Arkansas, a clinic technician drowned in a lake behind her workplace. In Oklahoma, an entire patient ward had been relocated after a flood that left no trace of their records. Every event was different, but the aftermath was the same. Secrecy, silence, and the slow erasure of a community. Mercer called it the quiet vacuum. When he overlaid the incidents on a regional map, the towns formed a rough crescent, running from northern Mississippi through western Alabama, crossing into southern Tennessee right in mouth. The center was Carter's Ridge. He shared his findings with a trusted colleague, Special Agent Dana Holloway, who had worked with him on cold cases before. Holloway was one of the few people Mercer believed wouldn't bury what they found. She agreed to help, unofficially. Together, they began comparing medical employment records from those regions. One by one, names emerged. 10 hospital staffers over a 9-year period, all female, all in their 20s or 30s, all with clearance to restricted patient files. The last entry on the list, Rachel Whitmore. But there was something else. All 10 names appeared in payroll systems managed by the same subcontractor, a small firm out of Huntsville, Alabama, called Echelon Data Systems, which handled digital archiving for hospitals during the early transition from paper to electronic records. The company had gone bankrupt in 2001. Its CEO, Robert Kell, had vanished. Holloway dug deeper into Echelon's background. On paper, it was a tech supplier, but its founding documents listed an early investor, a private subsidiary registered under the Department of Energy's Research Division, the same department tied to the Meridian Initiative. When Mercer saw the name, he understood why this had stayed buried for so long. They weren't looking at a single case anymore. They were standing at the edge of a network that had quietly rewritten history across half a dozen states. Holloway arranged for a meeting with an old contact in D.C., someone who'd worked in medical oversight during the late 1990s. They met at a small bar 3 blocks from Union Station. The contact, an older man named Harold Benson, arrived nervous, checking over his shoulder before he sat down. "I can't be seen with you," he said. "What you're touching, it was buried for a reason." Mercer slid a folder across the table. "We're not looking for secrets. We're looking for the truth." Benson studied the pages, the maps, the names, the pattern. When he spoke again, his voice was low. "You ever heard of the Patient Retention Directive?" Mercer shook his head. "It wasn't public. It came out of the early radiation studies in the 1970s. The DOE partnered with local hospitals to test neurological recovery from low-level exposure. It was supposed to be about resilience, not harm. But when early trials produced side effects, hallucinations, loss of memory, behavioral changes, they shut it down on paper. The data was too valuable to destroy, so they transferred it to private labs under contract. They called those transfers retention. And the patients? Holloway asked. They weren't released. They were moved. Benson hesitated. You're not going to find graves. You'll find records that don't exist anymore. That's how they erased them. He pushed back the folder. If Rachel Whitmore saw those names, she wasn't supposed to. And if you keep pulling, you'll end up like her. When Mercer asked what he meant, Benson stood to leave. Look around, he said quietly. The ones who ask too many questions start losing their memories too. Sometimes, literally. That night, Mercer sat alone in his hotel room, listening to the hum of traffic outside. He'd dealt with corruption before, political cover-ups, internal leaks, organized crime. But this was different. This wasn't about money or power. It was about control, the ability to rewrite history by erasing it. The next morning, Holloway called. She'd found something in the National Personnel Archive, an internal transfer list from 1999 marked Reallocation Site 27. It included the name of a medical facility that no longer existed, St. Luke's Annex C, Carter's Ridge. According to federal records, the annex had been demolished in 2000. The demolition contractor listed? Echelon Data Systems. Mercer and Holloway drove out to the site. It was nothing but flat land now, wild grass, rusted fences, a sign half buried in the dirt that once read Property of St. Luke's Hospital. Beneath the ground, the remains of the old annex still lingered. Concrete foundations, drainage tunnels, sealed doors. Local maps showed no mention of the annex. It was as if the hospital had been built over and quietly forgotten. They spent the afternoon walking the perimeter. On the north edge, Mercer found a half-collapsed service hatch leading into the foundation. Inside, the air was cold and metallic. The flashlight beam caught flashes of rusted equipment, oxygen tanks, and a row of empty examination chairs lined against the wall. But what stopped him was the writing on the wall, faded, barely legible. Meridian test block. Clearance required. The walls were lined with lead paint. Holloway took photos, marking every symbol. Near the back, she found an old clipboard wedged under debris. The paper on it was water-stained, but two names were still visible: E. Cole and R. Whitmore. Mercer felt a chill run through him. Rachel had been there, not just as a nurse, but as part of the final recorded shift before the facility closed. They sealed off the area and called for backup to collect samples. The Bureau's evidence team arrived by nightfall. Hours later, Mercer received a call from the lead tech. "You should see this," he said. Inside one of the sealed drawers, they found a small film canister. The label read, Meridian Control 498. When they played it back at the Jackson office, the footage was grainy, color-shifted, but unmistakably real. It showed a hospital ward lined with gurneys. Medical staff moved quietly between them. At the edge of the frame, a woman adjusted an IV drip. Rachel. In the background, a man in a lab coat wrote on a clipboard. The camera panned briefly, revealing his ID tag. DOE Research Oversight. His name was blurred, but his initials were visible. RS. Then, as the footage rolled, the lights flickered and the sound warped. The screen crackled to static. When it cleared again, the room was empty. Every bed, every staff member, gone. The reel ended there. Holloway stared at the blank screen. "This isn't a missing person case anymore," she said quietly. "This is containment." Over the following weeks, Mercer's office became a war room. Charts covered the walls, connecting towns, names, and hospital contracts. He requested satellite images from the late 1990s, hoping to trace the network of annex sites. Most came back classified. But one image from 1999 caught his attention. A cluster of trucks parked outside Carter's Ridge Hospital in the middle of the night. Every vehicle had the same marking, a three-pointed triangle, the DOE hazard symbol. When Mercer tried to obtain the original negatives, he was told they'd been destroyed in a flood. By now, Holloway was growing nervous. She'd started receiving anonymous emails, short, cryptic messages that said things like, "Stop digging," or "Meridian was never declassified." One morning, she found a manila envelope on her car windshield. Inside was a photo of her son walking to school and a note that read, "Stay out of Carter's Ridge." They both knew the risk, but by that point, walking away would mean living with what they already knew, that Rachel's disappearance wasn't an isolated tragedy, and that entire communities had been manipulated to protect something that should never have existed. Mercer's next move was to take it higher. He prepared a detailed report for the Bureau's Internal Affairs Division, outlining every link between the missing nurses, Echelon data systems, and the Department of Energy's off-record medical trials. He never heard back. 2 weeks later, his access to the Bureau's database was revoked. His field assignments were suspended. Officially, the reason was misuse of classified channels. Unofficially, he was being silenced, but not completely. Before his clearance was terminated, Mercer had downloaded copies of the Carter's Ridge footage, Rachel's letter, and Benson's directive notes. He stored them on an encrypted drive and mailed a duplicate to Holloway's home. They didn't know it then, but that drive would become the single most important piece of evidence in a case that, for decades, the public would never be told existed. Because within those files were coordinates, locations of other Meridian test sites across the United States, and one of them was still active. By the start of 2007, Daniel Mercer was no longer on the Bureau's payroll. His suspension had turned indefinite, and his credentials had been quietly revoked. The official statement cited procedural violations and mismanagement of restricted material. In the field, that kind of phrasing meant one thing: someone wanted you to disappear without making it look deliberate. He moved into a rented house outside Birmingham. Most nights he kept the blinds drawn. His phone lines were silent, except for the occasional click that told him someone else was listening. The work had cost him more than a badge. It had cost him the comfort of certainty. Still, he couldn't let go of what he'd found. He and Dana Holloway stayed in contact through encrypted channels. They spoke rarely, meeting only when necessary, using public places. Rest stops, libraries, diners that still took cash. Each time, Holloway brought updates from a friend she trusted inside the Bureau, someone willing to quietly feed them scraps. That contact said something strange was happening inside Quantico. A new division had absorbed the Meridian files, relabeling them as Archived Environmental Containment. The project names were scrubbed, but the document footprints, timestamps, access logs, metadata showed a surge of internal traffic. Someone was reviewing the material. Mercer knew what that meant. The Bureau hadn't buried the case. They were preparing it. For what? He couldn't tell. It was Holloway who first suggested going public. "We're out of channels," she said one evening at a highway diner off I-59. "If we keep waiting for approval, this thing gets rewritten again, and we disappear with it." Mercer hesitated. "You really think the press will take it seriously?" They will if we give them what they can verify. Dates, locations, federal involvement. She already had someone in mind. Investigative journalist Eleanor Hayes, known for exposing military misconduct in the early 2000s. Hayes had burned her own bridges in Washington, but still had the kind of reputation that made powerful people nervous. They arranged to meet her in Atlanta under the pretense of a background briefing for a book project. Hayes showed up wearing a trench coat that looked older than her press badge. She listened more than she talked, flipping through Mercer's documents with the slow focus of someone weighing risk against truth. When she finally spoke, her tone was clinical. If even half of this is real, it's the biggest domestic cover-up since MK Ultra, she said. But to print this, I need evidence that breathes. Paperwork alone won't do it. Mercer nodded. There's footage, and there's an eyewitness, at least one who's still alive. Hayes agreed to help. She would work quietly, verifying names through her network, pulling death certificates, cross-referencing medical staff. For the next 3 months, they built a file that was nearly watertight. 10 confirmed disappearances, 3 demolished hospital wings, 2 sealed DOE contracts, and 1 nurse who had seen too much. But leaks have a way of drawing heat. In March 2007, Holloway's apartment was broken into. Nothing stolen, nothing destroyed. Just drawers left open, computers unplugged. Papers moved an inch off from where she'd left them. When local police arrived, the report was filed as no forced entry. The same week, Hayes received an unmarked envelope containing her own press ID and a single line typed on white paper. Cease publication. This is your only notice. She didn't back down. If anything, the threat confirmed she was getting close. By April, they had enough material for a full expose. Hayes drafted the first version of the article, an investigative feature titled "The Town That Vanished Twice." It detailed Rachel Whitmore's disappearance, the Meridian Initiative, and the pattern of vanished hospital staff across the South. She planned to release it through an independent digital outlet she trusted. But before it went live, her servers were hacked. The backup copies vanished. Emails were wiped clean. When she called her web host, they claimed no record of her account existed. Mercer was in Jackson that night when his phone buzzed with a private number. A man's voice, calm and direct, came through. "Agent Mercer," the caller said, though he wasn't an agent anymore. "You have something that doesn't belong to you." Mercer didn't respond. The voice continued. "You're not being targeted, Mr. Mercer. You're being warned. Walk away, and this ends here." Then the line went dead. He looked out the window. Across the street, a black SUV idled, engine running, headlights dimmed. When he stepped outside, it drove off without hurry, turning the corner as if it had been waiting for that cue. By morning, he was back on the road to Carter's Ridge. He needed to see what was left. The town had changed again. More decay, fewer people. The diner's sign had fallen. The church remained a charred shell. Only a handful of houses still had lights on. He stopped at the old sheriff's office, now empty. Through the dust-covered window, he saw file cabinets still standing, rusted shut. He broke the lock and found one drawer that hadn't been emptied. Inside was a single envelope labeled Whitmore R. Media Copy. Inside were photographs, film stills from the Meridian reel. Rachel's face blurred by motion, her hand steadying a patient's arm. On the back of one photo, faint pencil marks spelled a single word: survivor. That word stopped him cold. Until that moment, every record had ended the same way, with disappearance, presumed death, or silence. But the photo hinted at something else. Someone who'd lived through it. He brought the photo to Holloway, who ran it through a database search. The patient number on the back matched a medical transfer record from 1999. Destination listed as a Shelby County Rehabilitation Center, an unmarked government-run facility for post-exposure recovery. The name had been redacted, but the signature authorizing the transfer was familiar. RS. The next week, they drove to Shelby County. The facility was still active under a different name, Eastwood Federal Care Unit, a private contractor site leased to the Department of Health and Human Services. At the front desk, a clerk in a white uniform checked their IDs. "We don't have public patients," she said politely. When Mercer showed his old bureau badge, she faltered. "Wait here," she said, disappearing behind a security door. 10 minutes passed, then 15. Finally, a man in a gray suit approached. "There's no one here by that name," he said, before Mercer even spoke. "You're mistaken." But Mercer noticed the man's lapel, an access pin with the same triangle symbol from the old DOE trucks. They were escorted out. That night, Holloway checked state health databases. The Eastwood facility didn't exist in any public registry. No staff, no funding trail, no patients. It was an invisible institution operating under federal contract. They were running out of time. Hayes decided to pivot. If her article couldn't go public, she would stage a controlled leak, send copies of the files to multiple journalists at once, ensuring redundancy. She set a date for release, May 10th, 2 days before, she vanished. Her car was found abandoned outside Chattanooga. The engine was cold, keys inside. On the passenger seat lay a single envelope addressed to Mercer. Inside were photos from her investigation, grainy images of the Eastwood facility at night, its windows covered, trucks entering through a rear gate, and a short handwritten note. "They're still moving them." Holloway's voice broke when she read it. "They took her." Mercer stared at the note. It wasn't anger that he felt. Not at first. It was resignation. The same quiet realization Rachel Whitmore must have felt the night she wrote her letter. That there are some truths no one wants told, and those who carry them are treated as part of the evidence. Still, he refused to stop. He gathered every copy he had left. The Meridian footage, Rachel's letter, the Polaroids, the field maps, and placed them on a single encrypted drive. He made one more duplicate and hid it in a safety deposit box registered under a false name. Then, through an anonymous contact at a small Tennessee radio station, he released a 20-minute audio file under the title, The Meridian Recordings. It wasn't an expose. It wasn't even a confession. It was simply Rachel's voice, restored from her old cassette. Trembling, human, undeniable. Within a week, it spread online. Forums lit up. Bloggers called it a hoax. Others said it was proof of government experimentation. The FBI issued no comment. The DOE denied involvement. But the recording couldn't be erased completely. It existed now. In the cloud, in private archives, on drives passed hand to hand among people who still believed the truth mattered. Mercer went into hiding soon after. Holloway transferred out of state. The official investigation was closed once more, labeled unsubstantiated. For a time, Carter's Ridge faded back into silence. The buildings rotted, the Pukot River rose, and another generation grew up never hearing the name Rachel Whitmore. But the file persisted. The drive remained. And somewhere, beneath those sealed archives, the Bureau still kept Box 27B under lock and key, its contents marked restricted. The truth hadn't died. It was only sleeping. 15 years passed before anyone heard Daniel Mercer's name again. By 2022, most people who had worked the Carter's Ridge case were gone, retired, or quietly forgotten. The FBI's public archive listed the Whitmore disappearance as unsolved, inactive. To anyone looking in from the outside, it was a line on a spreadsheet, a missing woman in a small Mississippi town that no longer appeared on most maps. But in a quiet cabin, near the Appalachian foothills, the man who once carried that case like a scar was still alive. Neighbors said he kept to himself. They knew him only as Mr. Daniels, a quiet, polite older man who paid cash at the grocery store and walked the same wooded trail every morning. No one ever saw him with visitors. No one knew he had once been an agent. Inside, Mercer's world had shrunk to boxes. Old bureau folders, faded photos, and handwritten notes filled the small living room. On the table sat a laptop that never touched the internet. In its drive, the same encrypted copy he'd made years ago lived everything that was left of the Meridian investigation. The voice recordings, Rachel's letter, Eleanor Hayes's last photographs, all there. Time hadn't erased them. It had only dimmed their urgency. He'd aged into the kind of man who spoke less and remembered more. Every now and then, he'd play the recording of Rachel's voice, not because he hoped for answers, but because it reminded him that she was real, that the story hadn't been a hallucination, that behind every classified project and missing file was a person who had trusted the system to protect them. In 2020, a young producer from a streaming documentary studio contacted him. She'd found his name buried in an old FOIA appeal related to Project Meridian. Her message was polite, careful. She wanted to know if he'd ever be willing to talk on camera. For weeks, he ignored it. Then, one evening, he replied with 2 words, "I'm listening." When they met, he was cautious. He didn't sign anything, didn't allow recording equipment. But he spoke, slowly, methodically, about Carter's Ridge, the hospital, the van, and the woman who walked out after midnight. The producer was young, earnest, convinced that every mystery deserved exposure. Mercer didn't argue. He'd once thought the same thing. He handed her a single item, a USB drive labeled Rachel. "If you use it," he said, "don't try to tell people what to think. Just let them hear her voice." A month later, the studio released a short digital documentary titled "The Nurse Who Knew Too Much." It never mentioned the FBI or the Department of Energy by name. It didn't need to. The audio spoke for itself. Viewers heard the faint hiss of tape, the rustle of papers, then Rachel's trembling voice describing what she'd seen in the observation wing. It ended with her words, "If anyone ever hears this, please," and then the cut-off silence that felt like a lifetime. The documentary didn't go viral. It didn't break news cycles or topple institutions. But it lingered. It reached the quiet corners of the internet where people still cared about forgotten things. Small-town histories, missing persons, government archives that never fully open. A few weeks after the release, a box arrived at the studio's address with no return label. Inside was a single photograph, an aerial image of Carter's Ridge taken in 1999. In the lower corner, faint letters spelled DOE property, Restricted zone. There was no note, no signature, but the handwriting on the label was old and deliberate. The studio archived it, uncertain what to do next. When an assistant tried to contact Mercer, the number he'd given was no longer active. The cabin in Alabama was empty. The neighbors said he'd left 2 weeks earlier. No forwarding address. On the table he'd left behind were 2 items: a badge case with a faded FBI seal and a folded newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Federal Committee Moves to Declassify Meridian Records." There was no date on the article draft, just a penciled note in the margin. If it's true, she'll finally be found. To this day, no official record confirms whether those files were ever released. The Department of Energy denies any program by that name. St. Luke's Hospital remains closed, and Carter's Ridge is little more than a map coordinate swallowed by the river that once bordered it. But sometimes, when the river runs low and the water clears, fishermen say you can see the old foundations beneath the current, a grid of concrete and rusted pipes, the faint outline of walls that once belonged to the annex. And they say, on quiet mornings, when the fog lifts off the water just right, you can still hear something faint, a woman's voice echoing through the reeds, caught between the ripples and the wind. Not pleading, not afraid, just speaking. And every time someone new hears it, the silence that swallowed Carter's Ridge breaks, if only for a moment. Then the current takes it again, carrying the story back into the dark, where it was always meant to sleep. If you liked this story, please subscribe to the channel for more true crime mysteries.